Hello, this is Lee back once again for another video, and today I'm going to talk about another Star Wars comedy film. Now, there was this was released not too long ago. Rogue One, a Star Wars story, or as one reviewer called it, a Star Wars Christmas story, was released on December 15th of 2016. So here it is a few days later, and this is going to be a spoilerific review. And of course, I have my ticket stub, if you could see that there. They didn't have the standard regular viewing available, so I had to settle for the 3D. And gotta say, they have had many improvements since I've last experienced the 3D presentation. I don't really care for the digital projection. There's a lot of, whenever there's text, you see the little pixels. But the 3D was pretty good. I gotta say the glasses have improved significantly. I mean, look at these things. Just slight problem. They don't fit over your glasses very well, and you have to hold them there. So anyway, I may be asking for some accessibility issues. Maybe I can put together my own and just wear them. But anyway, whatever. You enjoy your comedy films, and I enjoy them too. I gotta say, from the outset, I was not expecting, to love this film. I thought, well, everyone else is reviewing it, gotta go along with in crowd, gotta be cool like the cool kids, do what they're doing, talk about the things they talk about, pretend you understand their lingo. So I went out and saw this movie, and I am a fan of the Star Wars, series. I didn't expect to like it, but I did, I gotta say. Now, I have a bone to pick with Rotten Tomatoes. Now, I know they are an aggregate site of reviews, and, all you gotta do is have 200 published reviews, and you're considered a film critic, and then you can go on there, and then they have top critics, which are just, print media, old media, magazines, newspapers, and so forth. But, anyway, according to the Rotten Tomatoes reviews, and of course this is all slanted based on nostalgia, the original Star Wars trilogy, they have it as, at the bottom, they have The Phantom Menace as a terrible, terrible film. The Phantom Menace, at the very, very bottom is a, rotten film. And I gotta say, they do have a point. It was very disappointing for many of us. How could it possibly measure up to the hype? All these years, George Lucas talking about his original vision, and I think that destroyed the magic for a lot of people. They realized George Lucas wasn't this, visionary genius who, held back all his talent that he was hiding from us all these years, and he was finally going to give us the real story of Star Wars. And it turned out to be, he's pretty much just making it up as he went along, and, just like any other director, and he wasn't this, old storyteller who was, just dusting off some old volumes and sharing it. He was pretty much using his imagination, and he was stuck because he was doing prequels. He'd already written the story, the main good part of the story, and now he was trying to fill in the gaps with stuff, and he kept, he was expected to surprise people and swerve them in every film. So he kept coming up with new things and new origins for old characters, and it just didn't really work. He tried, and of course, George Lucas, Lucasfilm and Skywalker Sound and THX and ILM, Industrial Light and Magic and all that, pioneering special effects, and, he certainly did that, and the special editions were, kind of tech demos for his prequels. The prequels told their own story, but Episode 1, myself included, I agree it's at the bottom. I don't know if it's as terrible as they say. Certainly as a Star Wars film, it's quite terrible, but, as a science, fiction, I don't really like that term, but, as a comedy film, it does pretty well. It does what it does. If you try to piece the story together, it doesn't quite work very well. The continuity's kind of off, and, there's thousands of comic books and novels and video games that were created just to explain away all the problems, but that's neither here nor there. Star Wars fans really care about their canon, and they really care about spoilers and, you know, merchandise and things like that. But whatever, it's I'm willing to be generous. It's you know coming on the Christmas season, and so I'm just gonna throw a bone and say, Star Wars Episode One: The Phantom Menace, not that terrible. But then I like terrible films. I enjoy bad movies. So I can appreciate it as a bad film. But anyway, Rotten Tomatoes goes on, and they say that Episode Two, Attack of the Clones, was bad. It was better than the Phantom Menace, and I agree with them, and it was better. And it was, there was some cringe-worthy dialogue and silly, sequences of CGI madness, as they say, and it is what it is. The Clone Wars they talked about for so long, in the backstory of the original Star Wars. And we finally got to see just a teaser of it, and it was kind of an interesting little plot and an interesting way to do it, but, it kind of fell flat. I would say, anyway, moving on, because we're focusing on Rotten Tomatoes. So they're saying Episode 1, terrible. Episode 2, a little bit better. Episode 3, they gave it a good rating. They said it was 79%, I believe. And again, this is just, the consensus of the critics at the time, the digital critics, as if they're digital themselves. But anyway, they said, that Revenge of the Sith was pretty good, and I would agree with them that it was the best of the prequels, just because it focused on, the more of the backstory. It wasn't obsessed with creating, so many new characters and plot lines that went nowhere and swerves. It was just, okay, fine. We're going to show you the stuff that we talked about in the original movies for the backstory. Here's the Clone Wars. Here's the origin of Darth Vader. Here's, the Jedi being killed. Here's the Empire taking over. Fine. There you go. So all of those interesting kind of original, but not what we were expecting plot lines from the first two movies kind of got quickly tied up and thrown away, and we just kind of got what we were always expecting. So it's almost like Episode 1 and 2 didn't even need to exist. Kind of a nice little experiment. I think maybe George Lucas should have done what I'm going to talk about later and just create a completely original story, not worrying about trying to tie up loose ends from a story he'd already written and released for so many years that it entered the public consciousness, and people beloved, this story, and now all of a sudden he's like, well, let me tell you the other installments. And anyway, so according to Rotten Tomatoes, Episode 1, Episode 2, Episode 3, finally something good. Now we get into the original trilogy. What did Rotten Tomatoes think? RottenTomatoes.com, not paid by them. They said that next, Return of the Jedi, 1% better than Revenge of the Sith. I'd heartily disagree with them. But, I get what they're trying to say. They're trying to say that, the prequels kind of went off on their own and kind of didn't recreate the original magic. But, of the original trilogy, the Return of the Jedi was the weakest installment. It just didn't have, the magic and the glamour of the other two films. And it just kind of tied things up, yeah, but not in a great way. And, there was... back then you didn't have, CGI, but you did have, merchandising. You always had merchandising. They were selling figures from the beginning. They were selling merchandise from the beginning, but, they really went overboard with it. It's like, here, let's have tons of little, cute little furry Ewoks for everyone to enjoy. I actually had to look and see. There are these dusty old teddy bears you can buy from the Return of the Jedi promotion. So, there you go. It kind of... People got cynical. The kids had grown up with the original Star Wars in 1977. By 1983, they were kind of getting tired of it. And the reviews that you see online for the original Star Wars trilogy, viewed through rose-colored glasses. But, the general public always, at least the way the media portrays it, you ask an individual Star Wars fan, they're going to have a different opinion. Very often it's like the one they grew up with, that's the one they like the best. But whatever. I can see where they're coming from. Return of the Jedi, not as good. The Return of the Jedi was the worst of the three. George Lucas was going through a divorce at the time. He was kind of wrapping things up. He talked about, oh, I always intended to make 6 movies. 9 movies. 12 movies. But, he just kind of quickly finished up Return of the Jedi. He didn't have a lot of involvement with it as, he was just really stressed out. And, it is what it is. But I think in terms of popularity, that was the height of Star Wars popularity, and it just kind of fizzled out after that until, the time of the prequels. We had a little trickle here and there with the expanded universe, novels and things. But anyway, according to Rotten Tomatoes, Episode 1, Episode 2, Episode 3, now we're in good territory. Episode, 6, Return of the Jedi, just slightly better. Then they said the original Star Wars, they said it was 94%. Just an almost perfect film according to them. Very good. And I would say that there's a lot of problems with the original Star Wars. It's the one that started it all. It was a very derivative, movie. It copied a lot of westerns and, samurai films and Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers serials. And I don't mean grain cereals. But, that's the stuff that George Lucas always enjoyed, those cliffhanger, installments that you see in the theater right before the main feature, these cheesy, space action, thrillers. And he just kind of thought, well, just like Indiana Jones is, a throwback to those types of, archaeology, treasure hunter, adventure stories. So the Star Wars, which came first, was the space opera adventure, comic book-esque, cartoony style of live-action adventure, with the used universe. And, it just really captured a new generation of, movie-goers. He called it fairy tales for kids who didn't have fairy tales. I called comedy. But anyway, it was an interesting portrayal of outer space, and, different portrayals of people, from other worlds, hodgepodge different things. Different, but familiar at the same time. You could identify with the characters. There was, I think that's the key. No matter what setting you're in, you have likable, identifiable characters and a sense of fun, a sense of, humor, a real sense of character, despite all the action. I differ from Rotten Tomatoes, but anyway, so they're saying the original Star Wars, 94%. But interestingly, when, well, I'll get to that in a second. Empire Strikes Back, the sequel, directed by Irvin Kershner and worked on by Gary Kurtz, George Lucas had very little involvement. He kind of just gave it to other people to work on, based on his ideas, of course, but most of it was done by other people. The original Star Wars, they say, was saved by his wife doing the editing, because the first cut was kind of a mess, kind of rough, and that's true of most films. But they were on a low budget and time constraints, and he wasn't a big time filmmaker at the time, so Star Wars got saved, and it was a big risk. They went over budget with Empire Strikes Back. They took a big risk, and he gave it to other people. He came back and kind of got a little scared, kind of panicked a little bit, and tried to take the reins back, and then he thought, it's already gone too far that way, let's just do it. So they released Empire Strikes Back, and I think it paid off. A lot of fans you ask, who grew up in that era will say that Empire Strikes Back was the best. It might be because, it has kind of the romance, and, kids starting to grow up and starting to notice the opposite gender and kind of getting romantic. The romance in it is kind of cheesy, if you watch it. Not as bad as some of the stuff that you see in the prequels, but of course the stuff in the prequels you could say, well, is meant to be cringeworthy because you've got a Jedi and a senator, two people who are not really in the romance business, trying to kind of start this romance on the side during this, big war and upheaval, and don't really know what they're doing. But, whatever. So Empire Strikes Back, they said, was better than the original Star Wars. And I guess in a way, it expanded the universe. It really developed a lot of the things people think of. Darth Vader as this unstoppable, evil, powerful villain. In the original, he was kind of just a henchman, a lackey. And yes, he was an ace pilot. He was a threat, a serious threat. We never saw the Emperor. We didn't really know much about him. We finally got just a glimpse of him in this movie, and it was like, oh, he's actually Vader's master. What? Vader is this terrible? The Emperor must be, horrific. Who is this mastermind? And he has the dark side of the Force? Really? He's not just a bureaucrat or something like that? He's not someone like Grand Moff Tarkin, Governor Tarkin, the Death Star guy. So, they said 95% for Empire Strikes Back. And, I'd say that's pretty fair. It's not a perfect film either. None of them are. But, it took what Star Wars had and kind of grew it a little bit. Made it quite enjoyable. There's some as an action film, it's not, throughout. It's not fast-paced like many modern films, but, it keeps you going. So, I'm talking more and more about these films, but by the time you get to The Force Awakens, Episode 7, the recent film, it's only been out a year now on digital versatile disc and Blu-ray, digital, playback medium. So, they gave it a 92%. And when it first came out, Force Awakens, I was appalled. I thought I couldn't believe the rose-colored, goggles. These people were, looking at this. The nostalgia fanboys had all become reviewers, and they were saying it was better than all the other films. They gave it some absurd, 95 or 94%, and it steadily dropped. Now it's standing at about 92, so everyone's reviewed it. So they're saying it was not quite as good as the original Star Wars. Now, the interesting thing about The Force Awakens is that, it was really a tribute to the original Star Wars. If you watch it, it's not a shot-for-shot remake. It's kind of like a remake in the old sense of remakes. It wasn't Psycho, but it was, just every scene, every character reminds you of the old movie. And there's like an equivalent of just about every character here and there and plot line. Some things are slightly changed, and there's callbacks, as they say, tributes, cameos to Empire Strikes Back moments, and Return of the Jedi, certainly, which I think works against the film. I mean, it got high praise. My problem with tribute films like that, you watch it, you kind of enjoy it, but, the trouble is we live in the digital age. Just a couple of taps of your finger, or swipes of your whatever appendage, you can call up the original films and watch them in, high definition streaming quality, or, check them out and buy them for a few dollars, or whatever currency, online. You can watch the original film. You don't have to, settle for someone else's interpretation of what they thought was cool about the original film. And especially because Episode 7 was marketed as a sequel. This is the long-awaited sequel. This is, the next installment that, George Lucas always intended, even though Disney basically just bought the whole thing. He sold it to them, and he had no input whatsoever. I guess he sent them a bunch of ideas, and they just said, nope, no thanks, we've got it. He referred to them as white slavers, and I think people misunderstood what he was saying there. That's a reference to, shall we say, the selling of, human trafficking is what they're talking about. So, basically it's like they took his creation, his child, and exploited it for gain, which of course, what would you expect them to do? That's what companies do. They're profit-making machines. They don't care. I have more to say about The Force Awakens, but, Episode 7 is kind of like you fed all the data from all the old movies into a computer, and then that computer spit out a new film, just made up of moments of other movies. But actually, I have a new interpretation of The Force Awakens, and, that's going to get away from me. I'm going to talk about Rogue One, finally. I watched a review from this gentleman where he spent almost the entire review talking about food. It was wonderful. I felt like, I was very entertained. My reviews are entertaining to me. And, if you are entertained, wonderful. But let's get to Rogue One. Because I think it's very, very different as a film from The Force Awakens. This is not a sequel, this is a prequel. And here begin the spoilers, if you care about that sort of thing. A Star Wars story. So this is a 2.5-hour film. I saw it in the theater, of course, in 3D. I'd say the 3D effect was understated, which is good. I like to forget that it's even there. And there's a couple of moments where it, kind of enhances things. You see some little mist in the background, or some wet glass that someone's looking through, or just a big vista, you just look out and you see a big expanse. And I even stayed for the credits, because the credits were cool and a little Starfield. Well, this movie begins, and people always do these reviews where they do a synopsis of the entire film. Is that really necessary? I'm just going to jump around and talk about some just little moments. So it starts without an opening crawl, and if you've seen other reviews, I'm sure everyone has said that. I haven't really watched any in-depth reviews yet, because I was avoiding spoilers. But there's no opening crawl, which, I think others have joked about it. I think AVGN once said that, Episode 1 should have had no crawl, because there was no story before this. Of course, if this is a fictional universe, of course there was a history, but there's no story. This is a prequel to the original film. It's supposed to have taken place, I guess shortly before, moments, hours, whatever, before the events of A New Hope. And they talk about hope quite often in this movie. And this was digital and live action, of course, but there was quite a bit of CGI. And I've got to say, the CGI took me out of the film. Most of it was bad. I mean, sure, the work with the spaceships and star battles and planets and things, that was fine. I'm talking about the creatures. I'm talking about the living persons in the story. There's just a little bit of a problem. What I mean by that is this, and I heard a couple of, people say that kind of out on the side. Oh, there's some problems with the CGI. And now I see what they were talking about. There's various times, and spoilers, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so you have characters from the original Star Wars. You have Grand Moff Tarkin. He's never called that in the film, but, Governor Tarkin, played by the late Peter Cushing of Hammer film fame. He is a CGI face. And he has the voice very similar. I'm sure they did it all with computers. I don't know if they had an actor to just kind of stand in and then CGI'd the face. It wasn't quite... I mean, things have come a long way since Final Fantasy, The Spirits Within, but you could tell it was CGI, even if no one had told me, well, this is an actor that is, deceased, so it couldn't possibly be him. It's not someone pretending to be him, it's a computer. It looked a little off. Peter Cushing always had a very distinctive face, but his face didn't look like computery. The thing is, if you watch enough CGI, your mind kind of gets used to it. You don't really think about it as fake. But then when you see the real thing, like you see a real physical object, like a mask, or, flesh, or or you see... Oral Knots is a good channel. You should check it out. Anyway, if you see the real object, you go, oh, wait a minute. Of course. You have something to compare it to. Think about it this way. Jabba the Hutt in the Star Wars Special Edition. The original, it looked almost like a little clay model. Then they updated it to the Episode 1 version. It looked better. But when you see the puppet, rubber Jabba the Hutt, I mean, okay, you say, well, the puppet can't do as much as the CGI, but in our mind, that's what Jabba looks like. That's the real Jabba who's really in the room with the other actors in the scene, and they're reacting to him, as opposed to, Harrison Ford is, he's talking to someone who isn't even there. He didn't even know about it because it was added later. In modern films, it'd be a green screen or blue screen, whatever. So, we know what Jabba looks like, what he's supposed to look like, and so we see the imitation, and then we look at the original again. It's ruined. Same thing with the stormtroopers. You know, the glossy plastic, armored henchmen, Nazis, soldiers for the Empire. These guys, these skeletons, running around shooting stuff, and they were completely useless in this film, as they have become in all the films except for, Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, where they were the good guys, at least at first. There's pawns in the Emperor's game, of course. But you look at the stormtroopers, and they look pretty good in the prequels. They look pretty nice. Pretty well done. But then when you look at the original films, you go, wait a minute. It's not right. Because, you got the subtle grime and the cracks and the imperfections and the armor, the way it moves. And, the interaction between them and the other characters. It's quite obvious that the real thing still is far, far superior. Now, we're talking about special effects from 2002, 2005. Now we're over a decade old. We look at Rogue One. The stormtroopers, as far as I could tell, except for maybe, when they blow up and go flying, were guys in suits. But they didn't focus much on them. It was funny because the advertising heavily, it was like stormtroopers, stormtroopers everywhere, stormtroopers, buy stormtroopers. Same thing they did with Force Awakens. It's funny, they were selling to children, the little flamethrower trooper. It's like, hey, they just massacred a bunch of defenseless civilians, and now he's burning the bodies with his flamethrower. Isn't that cool, kids? Here, put it in a birthday card. Oh, I'm sure the marketing people didn't quite, they weren't talking to the film people as very well, but whatever. The stormtroopers there, they just look so much more real when it's a person in a suit. So anyway, there were moments like that. So you have Governor Tarkin with CGI face, which doesn't look right. It looked pretty good for CGI, but I mean, when I look at that, I think that's good CGI. I don't think that's just an actor, and I don't even notice it. The less you notice the special effects, the better. So that took me out of it. There was also Princess Leia, and of course, she's an elder woman now, the actress, Carrie Fisher. So she wouldn't play herself, and if they got some other actress to play her, or just showed her from the back or something, people would say, oh, it isn't really her. They'd use CGI for her, and, I guess you could say, well, she wears a lot of makeup or whatever, a little easier, but still, not quite right. You could tell it was CGI. Now, the Mon Calamari makes me hungry when I say that. Aliens, people from other worlds, to use the politically correct term. When you get, Admiral Akbar from the Return of the Jedi, he's the Mon Calamari according to the expanded universe, people with their, fishy interpretation. It's quite funny. But, we know what they look like. They have the rubber, mask and the way their eyes move and, the wet, look and everything. And we know what they look like, but then we get the CGI version is just a cartoon character. It's quite obvious it's not what we're remembering, so it takes you out. And every so often there were little characters, little CGI-faced, people mixed in with the humans. So it was the CGI was bad. I didn't think it blended well. I think you do much better when you have practical effects and costumes, and I'll say that about the prequels as well. I mean, don't use CGI except when it's for something that you couldn't possibly do any other way. Or use it to enhance something that's, well, I guess that's the problem. They take a practical effect and they enhance it with CGI, and it just doesn't look quite right. So, and especially, it's something we already have seen before. We know what it's supposed to look like. And that's the thing. They didn't make Rogue One for people who'd never seen Star Wars. They made it very clearly, for Star Wars fans. There was so much, they called it fan service, but so many references. I would say Rogue One, as opposed to The Force Awakens tried to recreate A New Hope with moments from Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, and just a hint of the expanded universe kind of overlaid, but jumbled all up and not really following what the comics and stories, had, so you didn't have to really pay attention to that stuff. You didn't know that stuff, it wouldn't matter. Well, Rogue One is clearly designed to reference things that are in the original Star Wars movie, and also to reference things in the screenplays, the novelizations, the comic book adaptations, and even some of the other things, the Ralph McQuarrie, blessed memory, sketches, concept drawings from the behind the scenes of the original trilogy, especially the first film, storyboards, unused characters, unused vehicle concepts. Let me give you some examples. There's a big battle, and there's all these TIE fighters, which of course we've seen before, and X-Wings, but you get the Blue Squadron. Well, that was, the original. It wasn't Red Squadron. It was Blue Squadron, but because of the blue screen effects when they made the original film, it was hard to do, so they changed it to red. So you got that, and there were some very jarring shots of some of the original actors. They were actually clipped from the original Star Wars film from 1977. You had Red Leader in there and some other people, Gold Leader, and they just kind of changed the background. And that was kind of fun, but it was also jarring, kind of like the CGI. It's like, oh, this is a shot from a different movie, just clipped in, like a fan film. Like you have these clip shows, what if Captain Picard fought the Death Star? And then you just the clips back and forth. It's obviously from different sources. But anyway, whatever. So, Blue Squadron, there's an example. You get these big vehicles with these, giant wheels, which actually they used in Return of the Jedi. Not Return of the Jedi, Revenge of the Sith, excuse me. Similar title. Revenge of the Jedi was the original title of Return of the Jedi. But anyway, this big wheeled vehicle which appeared in Revenge of the Sith was a concept from, I believe, Empire Strikes Back. But they made it a prison transport instead of a, rebel fighting vehicle or Republic, fighting vehicle. What else? Oh, yes. There's a character, I would say the best character in the story was the blind man. I don't remember the character's name, but he was played by the excellent Donnie Yen. Because of his thick accent, his acting, it varies in Western English films, but his martial arts, demonstration is quite impressive. Kind of like the Bruce Lee of our generation. Very underrated actor. But anyway, he plays a blind man. And you think, well, technology-wise, don't they have little, Cyclops visors so he can, like Geordi, he can see with technology? Or can't they clone his eyeballs or something? But he's part of this, I guess, remnant of the Jedi. He's a guy who learned the Force, and he repeats it like a mantra, I'm one with the Force is with me, over and over. Like he was, a training to be a Jedi, but, the Jedi were killed, so he never finished. And he carries a walking stick, which later you see it looks like a lightsaber handle, with on top of a walking stick, and he can move really fast. I saw this in the trailers, him beating up stormtroopers. I thought, oh no, stormtroopers are already, their threat has already been diminished so much throughout the films. Anything can kill them. And now we just have ordinary people beating them up with sticks and punching them in the face, and that armor is useless. Well, at least there was a little bit more believability, because he does have a low-level force ability. He can move fast and dodge things even though he's completely blind. The idea of a blind, fighter from, the Jedi Knight series, of course that was Dark Jedi, but it's been done before. He was an interesting character, and he was sincere, trying to be, a follower of the old Jedi way, despite the fact that he didn't have the complete training and he didn't have the weaponry. Very humble character. Well, anyway, he talks about the force of others. That's what they used to call it. They didn't refer to the dark side as the Paraforce, but that was from the early screenplays, the early treatments, the early story versions of the original Star Wars, the force of others, not just the Force. And they talked about the Kyber crystals. Now, the Kyber crystals have been thrown around in the expanded universe before. The original idea was that, there was this old Jedi Master, this old man, this almost like deified figure, kind of like Obi-Wan and Yoda combined, and he had the Kyber crystal. It was this actual chunk of rock that was supposed to either contain energy from the Force, or they spun it out into Splinter of the Mind's Eye, a novel where it amplified the Force, and kind of like Spaceballs, you just find out, spoilers, that really that you had the power to go home anytime you wanted to, Dorothy. This was just just a token, just to boost your confidence. It really didn't do anything. You had the power all along. But anyway, that was the Kyber crystal originally. And then they talked about, in this story, the Kyber crystals were supposed to be, you never see them, but it's supposed to be, this is what powers Jedi lightsabers. Okay. And then I guess they had just a big stockpile of it, whatever it is, in this old temple on this planet we never heard of. And it was supposed to be, this was like the last remnants of the Jedi. I guess this is where they got, built all their lightsabers. Well, the Empire takes it over, and they just extract all the Kyber crystal from it. The blind man says, well, it's only from the heart of the hardest stars. I don't know if he's speaking poetically or literally, but anyway, whatever this stuff is, they mine it all out, and then they blow up the temple, and it's gone. And supposedly they use that then to fuel the laser on the Death Star. So I guess it's a big lightsaber beam. That's a kind of a nice way to explain it. Another thing they talk about is the wills. Wills. I think there was once a rumor that a will was like a species, Yoda. And they were just... But the original idea was this was the Journal of the Wills, kind of like Dune. You had the Bible of Dune telling the story, and historians are like taking it out, this old book, and dusting it off and telling you a little story, using it as a reference. But you never actually see it. Well, the Journal of the Wills was kind of like that. From the Journal of the Wills, the Adventures of Luke Skywalker was supposed to be Star Wars, the original novelization. And that was in the screenplays, but you never found out. So they reused that concept as the Guardians of the Wills. Kind of like these people that were, kind of just leftovers from the Jedi Purge. They were kind of keeping the memory alive and, talking about the Force and guarding the Kyber crystals. And, they talked about this a little bit in The Force Awakens, but the Jedi Church, although that's not in the movie, that's kind of behind-the-scenes material that you wouldn't know unless you read a novel or comic about it, but whatever. So there's other people in the galaxy besides just the Jedi that, get all the glory. There's other people that kind of supported them and kept everything going. It's not very believable in the Star Wars chronology because, the Jedi they basically ran everything. They were like, it was the Galactic Senate and the Jedi Council. They were like a branch of government, and then, the Chancellor, and then they got just massacred in a big political coup. Well, they tried to overthrow the Chancellor, who became the Emperor, and then he killed them all off in public fashion. Everyone should have known about it, and they somehow suppressed the memory of the Jedi in just about 20 years. It's like, do you remember world events from 20 years ago? Who knows? So it's almost like they're living in the Soviet Union. Nobody remembers anything but the revised official government history of everything. And ordinary citizens have forgotten about the Jedi. But it's not believable because, you get people like Han Solo who are supposed to be outsiders, criminals, thugs, lowlifes, rebels, people who don't listen to the party line, and they've never heard of this stuff. Or they think it's nonsense. It doesn't work. It doesn't exist. It's not just Han Solo talked about Jedi and the Force, not just as if, that was a long time ago. I'm sorry, they're extinct. He was like, they're just fakers, they're con men. I guess he'd never seen it before. The prequels create that problem because his partner in crime, Chewbacca, his right-hand man, his brother, his pet dog, well, his brother, whatever, his best friend, his co-pilot, was war buddies with Yoda. Who knew? And yet he doesn't believe it. So whatever. But all that aside, Rogue One doesn't really follow, too deeply into those things, but it brings back these elements that only super fans of Star Wars would know or care about. Everyone else just go, oh, well, okay, so you gave me some new stuff. Guardians of the Wills, Kyber crystals, Force of Others. Okay, that's interesting. But really, all they're doing is, Disney is just digging up those pieces because they own it all now. I guess they own the old screenplays and comics and stories. They own the whole kit and caboodle of Star Wars, and now they can cobble it together. But I think they did a better job this time because Rogue One was not an attempt to recreate the magic of the original Star Wars by copying the original Star Wars. It was telling a new story. And when I saw the trailers, because I allowed myself to see the trailers, I thought, Star Wars is kind of wearing thin for me. It's just not as, funny as it used to be. There wasn't a lot of laughs in this film either, but it kept me engaged. And I thought, at least they told a new story. Even though it's an old story, even though it's a prequel, they didn't just try to copy a movie that had already been done. It was kind of like Episode 1. Back then, we didn't know what to expect. We kind of had an idea. I thought, well, they're probably going to talk about the Clone Wars, and we're going to see a young Anakin and a young Obi-Wan, and they're going to go on adventures, and the Empire is going to come out of nowhere and kill everybody. But beyond that, we had no idea what to expect. And so we saw Jar Jar with his floppy ears and, bad grammar and everything, and it was just, huh? What is this? And pod races, and that takes up most of the movie, and, finally we get some cool stuff, but it's too little too late. But at least it felt like a new story, new episode. So even though Rogue One is covering old ground, they really tried hard, to give us, these prototype design TIE fighters, and they gave us stormtroopers that kind of looked like the old drawings of the stormtroopers. Of course they do this to make money, because in every movie there's got to be a new stormtrooper so they can put a new face on the little action figure and sell it to you. Oh, those were cool, but now you get the new stormtrooper. The patent is expired on those. Let's give you another one. So you got all black stormtroopers, which I guess are just the personal bodyguard of this one Imperial guy who wears white. We saw one Imperial guy who wore white in the background of the original Star Wars. He never spoke. Nobody had any idea who he was. In the expanded universe, they created this concept of the Grand Admiral Thrawn, and he wore white, but nobody knew anything else. So the Imperial guy had his motivations. He wanted to get the Death Star going to achieve peace through terror. And they really portray the rebels as basically terrorists, but they refer to, I did a lot of bad things, you get this ragtag group. I was really expecting, a copy of the old World War II, 1960s films and so on, where you get, you got the squad, the platoon of, you got the people from different ethnic backgrounds, and, the different, the family, and, the guy gets killed right after he tells everybody about going home, and, it's all really sentimental. Well, you really didn't get that. It defied my expectations. There were a large group of nameless rebels, red shirts, expendables, but the main story focused around the woman who goes by the name Jin, gin and juice, I guess. But in the trailers made it look like this, stuck-up, cocky kind of female Han Solo, but in reality, she was just someone who kind of survived. It sounds like she grew up in prison basically, until she was busted out by these rebels. Oh, that was another callback. Forrest Whitaker. He's not one of my favorite actors, but he plays kind of a broken down man who is mostly cybernetic, and that's a callback to some of the original scripts, where, before you had the concept of Darth Vader being a cyborg, he was just a bad guy. There was like 2 or 3 different characters that kind of got rolled into one to become the Darth Vader we know and love to hate. But the guy, he's more machine than man, and he's like, oh, I'm so sick of living, there isn't much of me left. That scene was straight out of the early script drafts, or the screenplay treatments. Anyway, he plays this mentor figure. I thought he'd had a much larger role, but instead he gets killed off pretty quickly. So he instructs, Jin, and she was much more not over the top emotional, but kind of like she's been in shock this whole time. She's just surviving. She's kind of jaded, cynical a little bit. but she's afraid. She goes through genuine emotion. She sees this hologram of her father that she hasn't seen in years, and she starts to cry. There's no tears at all. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. I guess they didn't want to give her, goofy-looking CGI tears. But usually in these films, it's rare to see that, because usually you'll see, the actor will be just kind of sitting there with tears just silently streaming down the cheeks. Or, if it's played for laughs, they'll just be bawling. But she was just, she was sad, but there was no tears. I guess, that's how some people cry, but it kind of, I was confused for a moment. But anyway, the idea was that, her father worked for the Empire. And he designed the Death Star. But he quit, I guess, after a while. He was one of these scientists that, like, he knew he was working for the bad guys, and eventually it got to him, and he tried to quit, but they dragged him back in. They basically forced him to go back to work and, do it, but then he kind of sabotaged it on purpose to try to make it, to try to, just bring back some good, because he knew he couldn't stop it. So he builds the weakness into the Death Star. Spoiler. Which I thought, was kind of like, it wasn't necessary, because the whole point of the original Star Wars was they steal the Death Star plans, this super weapon that's going to kill all these planets and rule by terror, sheer terror, scare everybody. No one will defy the Empire now because they'll just blow up your world. There's no defense against that. Well, the idea was, okay, they steal the plans and they're just going to analyze it by computers until they find a weakness. Okay, everything's got a weakness. There it is. Now let's destroy it. We have to destroy it, do or die. The galaxy depends on it. This is the only hope for freedom. They destroy it. The Empire gets a big setback, whatever. Well, it was interesting because it's like, okay, he purposely hides this flaw in the system, the thermal exhaust port. Well, they make it sound like, well, it'll start a chain reaction, destroy the whole station. And they hint at various things, and, it's kind of an interesting little idea. And, throughout the movie, there's kind of this grittiness, there's this darkness, which I expected. Other people had talked about and said, well, this is gritty, and, I heard they'd done some reshoots to try to make it a little lighter. This was not a happy-go-lucky adventure, film. You almost think that some of the emotions in the original Star Wars were, and you see this in Force Awakens, just kind of, characters recover a little too quickly from trauma. Something terrible happens to them, and it's just like, this would destroy anyone emotionally, but they kind of just, they have a moment or two, and then they just get back to work, and they never really deal with it. All their crying is off camera. And I guess for an adventure film, that's what you want, because, you don't want to spend, an hour watching, Luke crying over his aunt and uncle getting fried by the Empire. You don't want to watch, Princess Leia, just sobbing on her bed for hours, over her whole planet getting destroyed. They just have their moment and they move on. And I guess you just think, well, this is the stiff upper lip. This is World War II. People in the face of, destruction, unimaginable horror. They just kind of, they have to go on. And, if you want to write a book and, make a comic later where they deal with the repercussions, in their life, fine, whatever. You see how it changes them as a character. But they still have that hope, that spunk. They just keep on going. They deal with that a little bit more in this film. They try to deal a little bit more with the emotions. And I don't think that's a bad thing. One thing that really struck me of Rogue One versus Force Awakens is that Rogue One really made me think of that old idea. Long ago it was rumored, and then George Lucas himself talked about it back when he was still in charge of everything Star Wars, that he wanted to do this live-action television, Star Wars television, live-action, not just this, cartoon of the Clone Wars, or CGI Clone Wars, or Rebels. It was something later after Disney took it over. He wanted to do a live-action show about the Rebels. And I thought, well, this is exactly what it would be. This is a telemovie. This is a TV miniseries, a 3-hour TV miniseries that was put into theatrical format. And, maybe they decided to do it this way because that's the trend now. Instead of turning TV shows into movies, they're turning movies into TV shows. You have all these TV shows, these Netflix original, series, blah, blah, blah. They're desperately trying to get people to watch TV or streaming over their computers, once again. Well, Rogue One, I could easily see this as, being a multi-part, mini-series on television to jumpstart some live-action TV show. It would have been like Battlestar Galactica, not the remake, but the 70s version. Very high-budget TV show, very short-lived, but very impressive for the time. Maybe they thought, the CGI faces would look fake on the small screen. That's what I was going to say. The CGI just... Now, if I had seen Rogue One on television, I would have been blown away. I would have thought, this is amazing for TV. But then there's some sequences where, you see these two ships just smashing together, and you see the force field and people smashing. That was another callback. Ships crashing into a force field that's still up. That was from Return of the Jedi, from the unused concepts from the screenplay. You see all the ships pull up in time in the movie itself, but in the script it says that a few of them crash in. Well, that's what happens here. There's a force field around the planet. It's being protected. And then they basically get this one ship to kind of like push a Star Destroyer, a giant Star Destroyer that they disabled with ion cannons, shut off all the electricity, and then they push it into the shield generator and crush it. And then they can finally get through and they can beam the message out. And of course, all the characters get killed. And it's funny because that's what people said about the prequels. They always said, well, what's the point of introducing all these new characters? They're all going to get killed right before by the time the movie ends. But the reality is that didn't happen. Padme's family was still alive. Jar Jar was still alive. Most of the characters we met were still alive. Not just the characters that appear in the new movies. But in this one, they pretty much wrapped it up. Everybody dies. The droid character, who they introduced him supposedly as a comic relief, and he was kind of like he looks like he would have been at home in Guardians of the Galaxy, just kind of this, or maybe Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, just kind of a big dope, but he's a great fighter, and you almost feel something when he gets killed, when he gets destroyed, when he's terminated, and he looks like he fits right in. So you've got that guy, and then you've got the blind man, of course, and then you've got the woman, and then you've got Forrest Whitaker's short-lived character, and then you've got, the sidekick or the friend, kind of the guy who protects the blind man. He has this big, huge machine gun and this armor. He was kind of an interesting character. He kind of poo-poos all the talk of the Force from the true believer, blind man of Donnie Yen, his character. But, you see a camaraderie between the two of them. I had heard people, speculating, rumbling about political correctness when this movie came out, and that's not something that I really dealt with in these talks, but, there was this thought that, Disney is trying to market to as many people as they possibly can, so, they want everyone to imagine themselves as a Jedi, as a pilot or whatever, so they're going to insert every ethnic group, every gender, every color, into the story. I didn't see my own face on screen, but that's okay because, I can still identify with a character even if I don't look or sound like them. I would say that they represented pretty much everyone in this story. There were no Jedi except for the blind man who was learning to be a Jedi, and it was kind of tragic. It's like the Jedi are gone. He's never going to finish his training. And we get to see Darth Vader kill a bunch of people at the very end. He's just hacking people up. It reminded me of the Force Unleashed video game. And part of me thinks, why would Darth Vader really do this? I mean, you can sort of see him doing it like, well, of course he's a big bad guy, and this is the Empire Strikes Back, Darth Vader. He'd be hacking people up and throwing him around with the Force, and I'm glad they remembered to give him red eyes, just like the original movie, and the fact that he does gestures. Later in the prequels, they started this thing where whenever the Jedi use the Force, they have to use their hand to, like, pantomime the gestures. And it's almost like something they did to help the actors out, because it's like, well, how do I know what's happening? How do I react? How do I act? and the Force is supposed to be doing all these things because it's all post-production special effects. Well, Darth Vader was very subtle when he did the Force. He'd do a little pinchy, I'm crushing your head gesture, and then someone would get choked. When he's fighting Luke, he kind of like moved his arm a little bit, like, oh, I'm going to throw that box at you, I'm going to tear this thing off the wall and hit you with it. So he does that. He does one of these things, throws somebody around. They did the mind trick, but it was always very subtle. And you think, well, this is the Jedi. They've been doing this for years. They know what they're doing. They don't have to do these fancy things like in the expanded universe. I think there was something in the Clone Wars cartoon where Yoda, he does this, and he goes, and you see him, it's like he's using the Force to pick up these two ships and smash them together and rub them together. It's like, does Yoda really need to do all that to make it happen? Is the audience going to be confused if he doesn't do those little gestures? So anyway, I appreciated the fact that they tried to stick to kind of the spirit of the original, even though they were doing all this over-the-top action. Now, if you did watch Rogue One first, and then watch the original Star Wars, you go, well, where's all the action? Where's all the ships crashing together? This really assumes you've seen the other films, because, again, all the callbacks make no sense if you're not a super fan that knows these things. There was another moment where they had the two guys from the cantina that Obi-Wan cuts down that threaten Luke, and they're just like, hey, they say the exact same line. I don't think that was necessary, but it was just like, hey, remember us? Remember us from the other movie? Remember that? It's almost like they just threw that in there. I could just see them, throwing that in at the last minute just for fun, just to get fans to go, oh yeah, yay. There wasn't a whole lot of that, but those were kind of jarring moments. But, you think about the original Star Wars, it starts off, these Star Destroyers are just unstoppable. Deadly Imperial ships, and everybody's always afraid of them. And when the rebels finally start destroying them, it's like, wow! Someone finally, can beat them. And the stormtroopers, oh my gosh, these scary guys, and they're just slaughtering, unarmed civilians, they're killing, native populations, they're, torturing people, they're killing Jawas, they're just these horrible, they were the Nazis in the first one, they're the Ku Klux Klan in the second one, it just goes on. But finally the rebels are just like, just destroying them. It's like, yes, the good guys, the underdogs are rising up and just making a mockery of them. Well, the stormtroopers are a total joke in The Force Awakens. They're a total joke in this movie as well. And then they get these so-called elite. They always have to introduce these elite stormtroopers. The stormtroopers are already supposed to be elites. That's the thing that I think that was, people call this a brain bug. It's an idea that kind of gets out of control. It starts out, you just assume the stormtroopers are not the rank and file, everyday, these aren't like rent-a-cops, these aren't, policemen. These are the best of the best of the bad guys. They're not unstoppable, but they're supposed to be, expert marksmen and all this kind of stuff. But they've just become a joke. And they're, in Rogue One, they're already a joke. Yes, stormtroopers do kill people, but only like, I think most of the people they kill are running away, or don't have any weapons, or they have such superior numbers, and the guy's already wounded, and then they take him down. But just people just casually like, oh, shoot behind the back, oh, I nailed 2 more stormtroopers, oh, there's a grenade up, nailed like 5 more stormtroopers. They're just nothing. And so then they have to have these stormtroopers that wear like beige, and they're not much better than the ones that wear black, and they take a little more time to aim, and they actually take cover. Well, that's kind of good. But the stormtroopers really went downhill. If you want to see stormtroopers that are actually threatening, watch the original Star Wars. That's pretty much the only movie where they're worthwhile, except for the prequels where the clone troopers. Getting back to the political correctness thing, yes, you do see more female pilots. You see more, non-Caucasian, to use the term, characters, with a little bit of face time. That's supposedly the whole reason that Lando Calrissian, was really played by Billy D. Williams. Of course, the whole time, James Earl Jones was the voice of Darth Vader. But to get a visible minority, according to the American, demographic, to say, hey, look, we're not ignoring those actors in this fictional universe, galaxy. Um, something, I don't remember who said it, but someone said, well, the Empire is white supremacist. Really? I mean, obviously they're evoking, the Nazis and the Ku Klux Klan, but, you know, you really, most of the Empire you don't even see because they wear masks. So how do you know what they look like, really? I mean, as a small person, when I first saw the story, I didn't see Star Wars, so I didn't see Luke, taking off the helmet and everything. I thought they were robots. I didn't know they were people under there. And the only stormtroopers that we've ever seen take off the helmet, original stormtroopers have all been non-Caucasian. So isn't that kind of interesting? If I know my ethnicities correctly, which I don't. But anyway, I don't care what color they are. But some people got very feisty about those issues and kind of blew them out of proportion. This is just a regular film. It doesn't really make a whole lot of political statements. I guess you could say, are the rebels terrorists? They talk about doing terrible things. You see them, there's collateral damage when they're fighting, but most of the time they seem like pretty much the good guys. They're always helping people. They're fighting the evil Empire, and the Empire is kind of inept, but they're either inept or they're doing dastardly things. They're killing civilians. They're overreacting to things with violence. They're making threats. The Death Star blows up a bunch of cities. What did all those cities do to deserve being wiped out? And the Death Star, they blow up their own soldiers too. They don't even care. It's like, whatever. We don't even care about our own men. They're just disposable. So the Empire is clearly evil. The only sympathetic Imperial you ever get to see is the father of Jin, who's this scientist forced to work on the Death Star, and he deliberately sabotages it. And he eventually gets killed, but, he gets killed by the rebels. He's collateral damage in one of these bombings. And the second, there's this other character, and I can't remember if his name is Bodhi or Brody? Not Adrian Brody, but he's kind of this weaselly little guy, and he and Jin have this back and forth, and he's an assassin. He just murders this guy in cold blood early at the start, just because the guy was getting a little nervous, talking, about secret information, and he's going to murder, he's going to assassinate, the scientist who's her father, and then he kind of holds back at the last second, and you get the sense that, she hates him. She hates this guy. He's a guy that does the dirty work of the rebels. But then, Mon Mothma, who's played by, an actress, does a pretty good job. I think she was another good character, kind of an ensemble cast. She says something like, oh, yeah, they've been causing problems for the rebels. And so they kind of distance themselves from this, and there's a little bit of the political stuff back and forth, how they're trying to get all these factions to work together. I'm going to say the opening crawl of the original Star Wars does talk about how the Rebel Alliance, the rebellion, won the first battle against the evil Galactic Empire. And they do win the battle. And I guess when I was talking earlier about, the Star Destroyers kind of smashing into each other, stuff we didn't need to see because, it lowers the threat. It doesn't build up the threat. If you're looking at this as a linear progression, if we're supposed to watch Rogue One and then watch A New Hope and then Empire Strikes Back and then Return of the Jedi and then The Force Awakens, it doesn't work that way. And I think, George Lucas was always wrong when he said that, this is my preferred order. This is how you should watch the films if you watch them all. If you want to watch them all, here's how you should do it. You should watch the original Star Wars, because that was what was intended first. Then watch Empire Strikes Back. Then watch Return of the Jedi. Then take a break. A long break. Then watch Episode 1. Then watch Episode 2. Then watch Episode 3. Then watch... Wait for it. Force Awakens. Then watch Rogue One. Then watch the original Star Wars again. That's how you do it. Because, that's the way they were created, and that's the way they were intended to be viewed, because each of the movies, except for the first one, it assumes that you've seen the previous one. It assumes that you already know what's happened, what's going to happen, And the reason you're going to see it is because you want more Star Wars. That's what you're getting. And the fact that Rogue One, is kind of like a TV special with enhanced graphics on the big screen, it's worth watching on the big screen, I would say. But it really feels like a TV miniseries. Again, I compare it to Battlestar Galactica. The remake series had a miniseries that launched the official series, which, I enjoyed that series. Started off pretty well, but it was ruined by certain episodes, and I think it kind of went downhill towards the end. But a lot of series kind of wear out their welcome like that. It's best when they have a good plan to start with. If you're going to make a multi-part, saga, it's best to plan it out in advance and stick to that plan. Too many shows, they make too many concessions, they make it up as they go along, and it kind of ends up in a mess. I think that's what happened to George Lucas. He got trapped by his own story. When he deviated from it, it was just obvious. Well, Disney, they released Rogue One, and there's supposedly going to be 2 more Star Wars stories, which are just completely separate stories. One is about, well, we don't know anymore, but supposedly it was going to be young Han Solo, so I guess it's all going to be about smugglers and, finding Chewbacca and that sort of thing. Well, that could be interesting. That will ruin all the Han Solo adventure novels, but whatever. And then they were going to do like a young Boba Fett, which I guess people are still obsessed with Boba Fett to this day, just because he had just very few lines and kind of cool gadgets and things. But now we don't know what that's going to be. And then there's going to be Episode 8 and Episode 9, which I have really no desire to see those at all. But I'll say more about that. This has been a long, rambling review, so I would say here is my new ranking. This is my personal ranking. You don't have to agree with it, even though I'm right. Just kidding. Is this. I would say of the Star Wars films, my personal favorite is, and always will be, Return of the Jedi. It's the one I grew up with. It has the authentic, George Lucas seal of approval. It has the practical effects still. It almost works as a standalone film. Yes, I admit it has weaknesses. I can understand and perfectly accept those who say Empire Strikes Back is better. But I personally prefer Return of the Jedi, and I disagree with Rotten Tomatoes completely. There's no logic to the ranking. It's all just based on aggregate. So there's no logic behind that. There's no progression. And I'm sure, if you compare the reviewers who reviewed each of the Star Wars films, you're going to be all over the place. It's all personal preference. I think Return of the Jedi is the best. It just does the most with what it had back then. And it's a definitive end to the series. There's no need for anything else after that, except, fans desiring more of the same. Second, I would say it's tough because on a certain level, I want to say the original trilogy is the best. It's definitive Star Wars. The original should be the best because it's the one that started it all. But personally, for me, if I'm going to sit down and watch them, I would say I've often said this. There's really Empire Strikes Back. I would say not number 2 for me. Number 2 is Revenge of the Sith. But it's tough because this is a movie I've seen many, many times. And even though it's been quite a while since I actually sat down to watch the whole thing, it's tough to kind of sit through it again. It's like I remember it all so well. It's almost like I don't need to watch it. But even though I've seen Return of the Jedi so many times, I'll sit down and watch the whole thing just because I enjoy it. It's one of those movies that kind of just sticks with you. And it's not just rose-colored glasses, because I can see the flaws in it since I was a young person. I can see, I have a different perspective on it, but, while I can appreciate the other films more, I probably would have thought the original was kind of boring by comparison as a small person, but, I'd say Return of the Jedi is the best. Empire Strikes Back is not number 2. Number 2 is Revenge of the Sith. It just is. And number 3 is Attack of the Clones. But I put Attack of the Clones as a tie with Empire Strikes Back. And that's because even though Empire Strikes Back is better for storytelling, it's better for characters, it has a more leisurely pace. The prequels are all very uneven. They go from like really terrible to really good, and back and forth and back and forth. Attack of the Clones was kind of not so great until you got to kind of the part where the people get captured, then it's awesome from then on, and I really liked it. So, as an action film, I would say Attack of the Clones is still my personal favorite. But I'd tie it with Empire just because Empire you can sit down and enjoy the whole movie, and there's just maybe one or two moments that are kind of goofy or whatever, but you can still appreciate it. So then next I would put I would put the original Star Wars. And, again, I appreciated more after all these years. I think all the special edition changes were silly and unnecessary. The only thing I really thought was an improvement was the new Death Star battle from 1997. Even though there's a few special effects errors in there, they have all the X-Wings look the same and they have the same markings on them, even though they all should be different. But I think it looked really, really good. And I can appreciate what the original was with the original special effects, but that's one improvement. I think the other improvement was Return of the Jedi. The Rancor looked very, very fake once you got to the small screen, and the special effects were improved for that scene. But everything else just very unnecessary. Yes, the ending with seeing the other planets being liberated was kind of a cool moment, but not really necessary to the movie, and it almost breaks the flow with everything because you're kind of forgetting the personal story and you're going to some greater story. It's more like an epilogue. It would be like a post-credit sequence. You see the planets being liberated or something like that. But okay, so last I put The Phantom Menace, and because it was so disappointing and it had so many just bad moments. The comedy was just not very good. You had some great moments in the fight scenes with the lightsabers at the end, and stylistically, it felt like it was almost like the old movies. Even though the story, it wasn't very good, and there was too much CGI, too goofy, too cartoony. The pod race was too long, etc., etc. But still, it felt kind of like it was still fresh. And Attack of the Clones was like, okay, George Lucas is like, wait a minute, people are mad at me, let me backtrack, let me throw in some more action, let me try to be more like the backstory I was talking about in the 80s, and then he just finally went all in with Revenge of the Sith. So, I'd say The Phantom Menace is the weakest. Now, it's tempting to put The Force Awakens below The Phantom Menace, but that makes it sound like I absolutely hated it. It was terrible. But I really didn't. I thought that The Force Awakens was okay. It was a very average film. It was very even in tone throughout. There were some cool moments, but most of the film was just me thinking, I really enjoyed Star Wars. I kind of wish I was watching that film now instead of this one. Yeah, that's a cool moment, but I really wish I was watching Star Wars. They know that we have VCRs, right? And they know we have digital versatile discs. They know we can stream the old movie anytime we want. They should have just brought back the old Star Wars to theaters. So I almost thought Force Awakens was unnecessary. It was just a rehash. So if you look at it in the chronology, it's worthless. But I actually have a new perspective on The Force Awakens. I'm going to talk about that in another video. I've gone on long enough. But I would set it in another category entirely. And I would do the same with Rogue One. I would set it in its own category. So you get the ranking, you get the story, you get the chronology of the George Lucas Star Wars films. Return of the Jedi, Revenge of the Sith, Empire Strikes Back, and Attack of the Clones, Star Wars, and then Phantom Menace. Now, in terms of how good a film they are, that'd be a whole other list. If I had to rank them, though, I would say that The Force Awakens is probably a tie with The Phantom Menace, just because while it's completely unoriginal, completely boring in that sense, it's not a good sequel at all. As a standalone film, it's just fine. And The Phantom Menace was disappointing, it was uneven, but at least it tried to do something new. It tried to surprise us. It tried to go into new directions. And it did have some cool moments, whereas Force Awakens was just very average. And it was basically just a rehash. And we'd already had a lot of rehashes within Return of the Jedi. That's why I said it could be a standalone film. It's kind of like New Hope all over again with bigger budget. I would say that I enjoyed Rogue One infinitely more than I enjoyed The Force Awakens. And I didn't hate The Force Awakens. Again, I thought it was average. It was okay. But I have a new perspective on that, and I'm going to talk about that in another video. But I would say Rogue One is just its own story, its own animal, if you will. I'd say it's better than The Phantom Menace, perhaps. But I'd still watch The Phantom Menace before I'd watch Rogue One again, for some reason. I don't know. I mean, Rogue One is just not going to be the same once it's out of the theaters, because you do have, the big, epicness. It's really just aesthetics, It's like, oh, I like seeing shiny, plastic armor. I like seeing big fiery explosions. I like seeing big ships, moving slowly across the screen. I like to see glowy lightsabers. But those are just special effects. Those are set pieces. What about the characters? You did have some good characters in Rogue One. You had some funny characters in Force Awakens as well, but they just didn't. They seemed very fake to me by comparison. I fully believed that Rogue One's characters were part of that universe. And I'll say more about that in another video because I've rambled on. So now you know my opinion of Rogue One. Go see it in the theater if you're a big Star Wars fan. If you're a casual fan, you might enjoy it, but just think of it as a generic science fiction movie. I think you'll get a lot more out of it. If you're a super fan, if you've seen all the movies, and you've read some of the books and the comics, and looked at the old screenplays and you've studied them, if you're a really hardcore fan, you're probably going to watch it. You've probably already seen it, maybe multiple times by now. But I don't have a strong desire to go out and buy The Force Awakens or Rogue One for my permanent collection. I just don't. They're just average. They're okay. And it's not just because of George Lucas. It's just a different thing. But I could see it being, kind of a, just another movie that you go see and you enjoy it, and that's fine. So there it is. And happy holidays to you. Thanks.